Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's OXIFIED Fireside Chat. As you all know, the OXIFIED program is the Oxford Initiative for Inspiring Entrepreneurial Diversity, which is all about finding ways to understand, provoke, explore, and catalyze a more entrepreneurial startup ecosystem, particularly within the impact ecosystem. So we have a series of firesides of chats with leaders from across the impact ecosystem and beyond, exploring ways that the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion tie into social entrepreneurship, impact investing, systems change, and all of the big global problems and challenges that we're aiming to solve and that many of you are exploring within your MBA. And today we are joined by Monique Aiken. She's the managing director of the Investment Integration Project, which is a consulting services and applied research firm that provides advice, thought leadership, and turnkey solution to help investors manage systemic risk and opportunities. And why that's important and how that fits into diversity, equity, and inclusion is going to be part of what we get into in today's chat. She's also contributing editor at Impact Alpha, a publication that I'm sure many of you that are interested in impact investing probably are already reading. And for those of you who are entering the MBA and want to get into impact investing, you should definitely be reading to be up to date about the space. She also hosts The Reconstruction, which is a podcast about moving capital towards justice. She's the co-founder of Make Justice Normal, a collective that seeks to open space for people that are working towards a world in which capital, which is a proxy for structural power, embodies justice, with the ultimate goal of narrative change. She's also a member of the Fast Company Executive Board. So Monique, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
It is so lovely to have you. And I know that the MBA students are going to be illuminated and provoked by some of the things that you'll share with us today. And as those who've joined these chats in the past know, we're going from macro to micro. And the work that you're doing with the Investment Integration Project actually takes a macro view of the financial sector, but from a lens of various systemic risks, which include but are not limited to equity. And I know from knowing you personally that also relates to your broader journey. So with that, my first question is, what is your vision for sustainable and inclusive growth? And how did you arrive to that vision? Especially for the MBA students that are joining, that are embarking upon careers in the finance sector, the impact investment sector, all with a similar goal to the one that I know drives you about contributing to impact. What's your vision and how did you arrive there? And anything that students can learn from it.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. It's incredible to think about where I was to where I am now in terms of my mindset. And I think about where I was as a business school student. And if you told me that justice and systems thinking had anything to do with finance, I probably would have given you a blank stare. I wouldn't have understood how those can be put together. And partly that's the journey that we're all on, is to think through how we zoom out and be a contributor in making the world a better place. So, when I graduated from business school in 2005 from NYU, I went into commodity derivatives at Deutsche Bank. And I thought, after a number of years in that industry, my life purpose can't be helping energy companies manage the volatility of their income statement. That's not a reason for being. And I went on this journey to kind of understand how do my intentions around trying to contribute to making the world a better place, some of the things I was doing outside of the day job, like volunteering and being on boards of nonprofits and everything like that. How could I bring the doing good part of my day to my work day? And why do these two things have to be separate? At least they were in my mind then. And so, this idea of a vision for sustainable and inclusive growth and the world that we need to have right now evolved for me. And I arrived at it in many ways in thinking about, well, how can I, with my understanding of financial markets, contribute to making the world a better place? And certainly the term impact investing was coined, a handful of years after I got out of business school. And so this sector and the impact economy didn't exist in the same frame it has today. And so, as I was moving out of investment banking and thinking and the markets, thinking about where I needed to go next. And so that brought me to the Clinton Global Initiative, which was sort of like an advanced education in the social good interventions that the world needs, and sort of heightened my awareness of like the various tools and the approaches that, when combined with finance, essentially make impact investing. So as I moved forward and learned more, you got sort of to the edge of each next cliff and saw what else you didn't know, and climbed that additional mountain, and thinking through about how do I get to the vision I think now, which is we need to center systems change and center justice in that systems change. Well, how do you get there? It's about rethinking, it's about redressing, and it's about liberation. That's what I've arrived at, mostly through the work of the last year or so on the podcast, which is called The Reconstruction, as Tara mentioned, moving capital towards justice. And again, that sentence would not have made sense to me in 2005. And so what does that mean to rethink? It means thinking about the role of capital. Capital is an asset, it's neutral. So is a scalpel. You can kill someone or you can conduct life-saving surgery. So what are we doing with these tools? It's what we do with the tool that condemns or elevates it. We can either continue to be extractive with the way that we manage capital, or we can choose to be regenerative. We can choose to harm people on the planet, or we can choose to figure out ways to make more people have the opportunity to thrive and protect their planet with the way that we distribute capital. So that can be part of the solution. And finance, we have to rethink, what does finance mean? It's about the distribution, the way that we manage this capital and the money. What are the models and the norms that underpin this financial system? We have to rethink the people who created the things that we just accept as the way we do business, because the way we do business does not serve everyone. It was not meant to. So what does that mean? Does this system as present serve us? Does it serve our values? And if it doesn't, we need new models. We need new norms. So we need to think about the various stakeholders whose outcomes were not included in the design of how we do today, because those other stakeholders are the externalities that are not priced in. Well, that includes our value of natural capital. That includes our value of humans and people, and who was in and who was out. And what does it mean for how we value these groups, these things, when we didn't even consider them? They are called externalities. But when outside of a different industry or domain, the fallout occurs, doesn't mean the fallout didn't occur. It just didn't occur in the pricing of the thing that you designed for. And the system wasn't designed for some. It was meant not to. So what does that mean for the folks who were left out? Those people from a different gender. Different gender. What's the different gender? Women? It's 50%. So when we say like the different gender, the different ethnicity, well, what does that imply for who the norm is? It implies the norm is men, and implies the norm is whiteness. So what does that mean for people who don't come from places where the norm is whiteness? The global South, the Caribbean islands, Africa, Asia, Latin America. So who is inherently left out from decisions? And decisions are about power. So when we think about rethinking, it's about power also. It's about the way we use this neutral asset called capital. The way we use it is called finance, and the distribution and the way we manage it. And then ultimately it's about who decides. And who decides has value in that system, and who decides who doesn't. That's about power. Who has the control, authority, and influence about how to distribute these things that we have. And so when we think about this system as present, it means that we need to have, that there's something that needs to be redressed. And the redressal part of that is about the exploitation that already exists. Exploitation of Black bodies, women's bodies, the carceral system, immigrants, refugees, whatever country you're in. Those are the folks who have been exploited. Modern slavery still exists. Child labor still exists. The system still uses underpriced, not fair labor to make the present that we have. And this is in nearly every supply chain. So we need to think about that. We need to think about the ways that the system still continues to exploit. and ways that the system removes people from their lands, indigenous people in particular, modern gentrification in cities of today. And as we think about the urbanization that's underway all over the world, what does it mean? Who is displaced? Whose voice isn't heard, and who doesn't have the power to stop their lands from being removed, from what they have being taken from them? And we need to insist on regeneration in our practices. There are ways that we don't have to do it this way. We have accepted, or largely it still occurs, and there's not enough pushback against it from those who do have power. So we might mean certain groups and not other groups, because there are people who are pushing back. There's activist groups who have existed for decades, millennia, trying to prevent this. And really what the current system that we have would be already a dystopian reality for many Indigenous people. For those of us who are not Indigenous, the largely writing on the wall is that dystopian reality driven by climate change is coming. But for some people, it's here today. Their lands are already destroyed. Where they get their livelihoods is already diminished, and the land that they once knew that was lush, green, and offered sustenance does not deliver that anymore because of climate change, but also because of other reasons. And so when we think about whose dystopian reality we're talking about, it's today for some already. So we need to redress some of these injustices. And then after we've done the rethinking and we've done the redressal, what new models do we need to govern how we live today? That part, it becomes liberation. We cannot just accept what is, because that is the normal. But the normal, we already said, is broken. And we see that in many ways because the pandemic allowed us to see things that we didn't before. But many people never had the luxury of not seeing these systems failures because they were already harming them for a long time. And they're people for decades, maybe hundreds, thousands of years, depending on who we're talking about. So we need liberation to enable us to think differently and imagine a new reality where all of these things that we just talked through are not just accepted as likely outputs from the systems that's designed, but we can do better. We can liberate our planet from these the harmfulness that we've already just talked through. Because right now we're at a tipping point. I mean, Glasgow just ended. I'm sure all of you have paid close attention. Once certain tipping points around climate are crossed, the rest kind of doesn't matter. But we have to remain optimistic because we have an opportunity to make change now. So all of this leads to like the vision, and how I've come to it is talking to people. It's thinking through, it's reading over these things, because we need to get to liberation of spirit, new models that allow us to do things differently, not incremental change, because the urgency is now. So all that's to say, we need narrative change to be able to tell ourselves that we're capable of a different reality. And that's essentially how my vision is, that we can do better, and we have to, for people on the planet.
You speak a lot about inequality as a systemic risk, and you briefly touched on that just now. But can you share more about this, particularly from an investor perspective, as obviously this also relates to a new view of capitalism?
Yeah, and for those of you who are already looking at systems work in your studies, we should start with systems. Large social, financial, environmental foundations for society. These are the systems. But when we think about systems, the earth is a system. Humans are a system. We are comprised of a variety of systems. And this idea that income inequality is sort of like the chronic illness of our human systems. When we think about it, climate change is the chronic illness of the earth system. And income inequality, whether it's driven by racism, sexism, classism, and those things are morally reprehensible, it is also just a drag on our ability to thrive. It's a drag on economic growth. And in the book, 21st Century Investing, that TIP's co-founders, Bill Burkhart and Steve Weinberg, they talk about the income share of the wealthiest 20% increases by 1%. There's almost nearly a 1% drag on economic growth for 5 years to come. Fewer people can thrive. But if the income share of the poorest 20%, however, are increased by 1%, that's associated with a 0.38% higher growth. Drag or growth? Which one do you want? Income inequality, whether it's driven by any number of drivers, hurts us all. It hurts investors. It hurts the people that the fallout occurs to. But I'm not a mathematician, but one is greater than the other. So income inequality, for any number of reasons why it has occurred, it's the output from these things that we just talked about before. It's the output from systems that oppress, from labor rights and paying people poor wages. It's from modern slavery. It's from racism. It's from sexism. It's from homophobia. It's from ableism. You know, the reasons for that economic equality are many, but the output is that the systems were created this way, and the output is income inequality. And we talk about that because it's associated with frequent and more deeper economic busts. It's associated with more polarized politics within a nation and among nations. It's associated with social unrest. It erodes trust in institutions, including governments. So we can see in the United States, in the UK, and the countries all over the world that the outcome from an increasingly polarized society is harmful to democracy, which is one of the stabilizing forces and systems that we need in order for investors to thrive in. And the reasons why democratic systems are more preferable for investors, because they can use the court systems to get compensation if they've been harmed, and other things like that that are not available in places where, you know, there's autocracy, there's graft, there's other things like that. And so it harms the investor class too, to have economic income inequality as much as it harms individual people whose lives literally are affected by the fact that they can't earn a living wage, and the fact that, you know, they have the other social ills that fall from the inability to have a living wage: homelessness, drug abuse, the despair. You know, so it's on many levels that income inequality is just an important topic, and then maybe underappreciated in the ESG framework. The S is largely unappreciated, broadly speaking, in this. I think, you know, there are many reasons possibly for that, but also humans are messy. Environments and things that you can count, maybe less so, and humans speak up for themselves. The monkeys don't, the water can't, whales can't. And so when we think about, you know, just the way this all puts together, you know, humans are hard. But this is partly why we need to have a concerted effort to think through the ways that income inequality ravages people, but also the ways that the financial system needs to think about it more carefully and to be able to do something about it. And when we think about these systemic risks that you just kind of flagged, Sarah, it's that these are the things that you can't diversify your portfolio away from. They are pervasive. For an individual, what can you not diversify yourself away from? The air. We all breathe the same air. Might be geographically different from time to time, but the net effect is this air cannot be contained or separated from. And these systemic risks are things that cannot be contained, you know, by any one portfolio or one investor or even a major investor. Hiro Mizuno talks about being, you know, the universal owner. You are exposed to all of it, and therefore potentially it's your responsibility. This is where the universal ownership concept comes in, to being responsible for all of it too. And so, you know, income inequality is a flagship study area for the Investment Integration Project, partly due to, you know, our appreciation that it is an overlooked aspect that needs attention, and a systemic risk that, well, is likely only increasing in importance. And I think there's more awareness of it than ever before, just even in the last 2 years, inclusive of just system level investing, system level risk, systems and financial services that can go together. When they started the Investment Integration Project 5-6 years ago, people were confused and they were like, what are you talking about? Suddenly in the last 2 years, we all are aware of systems like never before, particularly health systems, thinking about economic systems, democratic systems. And so that awareness and inputting the really incredibly important systemic level risk of income inequality into that conversation just becomes pertinent to today and today's problems that we're all facing.
Fascinating. You've talked about the S in ESG, and you also talked about the E in ESG, and we're all aware of how, you know, ESG has been spiking and spiking exponentially. They're saying it's going to be the majority of asset management portfolios in the future because it's grown so much. And yet, the thinking that these funds show as far as the depth of the S is typically, it's typically not at the mark. And now with COP just having occurred, the E in ESG is getting so much fanfare. And yet, just as you pointed to the fact that you can't diversify away from the planet, nor can you diversify away from inequality, the two things have a link. So how do you see climate change and the topic of equity and inclusion as being linked, whether that's along gender or racial or geographic lines?
So maybe the real question is, why do some people think that they're not? Because humans are inherently multifaceted. We humans experience climate change. Humans are of a variety of ethnicities and races. Humans are men and women and other non-binary sexual orientations. Humans live everywhere. How could it be possible that it's not linked? Because humans experience climate. Animals experience climate. The earth itself is affected and humans are on earth. So linear thinking in this that we could compartmentalize is a luxury. And that's partly why systems thinking and the idea of systems thinking needs to be put into financial services and put into the financial system, because linear thinking is a luxury. I'm both a woman. I'm also a Black person. I'm also a child of immigrants. How can I separate these parts of my identity? I also experience climate change to the degree that it is affecting the increased nature of hurricanes in America and the fact that hurricanes are hitting the Northeast, where I happen to live, more frequently than they ever have before. So how can I separate these things? And the fact that the financial industry has largely sought to, well, that's a privileged position. How is it over there anymore? And I think it has largely historically been thought of climate change as a problem for over there, wherever you're over there meant to be. If we're saying that largely the financial industry is the domain of folks in the global north, particularly New York, London, and some of these global financial cities, right? And so the earth is a system. We can't diversify our way from the water or the air, and neither can people separate their own identities from, their experience of reality. And the term intersectionality was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in the 80s. That's now a long time ago. And the fact that, just in the last handful of years to a decade, has that term sort of become more commonly known, but it's your identity. It's who you are. A person who has a different ability is now no less the person, say that they're blind or deaf, than they are the person who is a man or a woman or some other non-binary sexual orientation or gender definition. And so when we think about all these things, how can we not say that they're interlinked? And so we have done the E largely, I think, because it's a little bit easier to count things, count carbon, count methane, trees, planting them. Do we have this many? The outputs from that are a little just easier to manage than the messiness of human beings. But we all experience the fallout if climate change is not rectified. And these are the externalities that we talked about before. These are the things that weren't designed for by the system that led us to where we are today. And so because all of these things are interlinked, so is all of the justices that I was getting to in the beginning. Climate justice, gender justice, economic justice, because the humans are the people who experience these things and who have experienced the historical harm for them. And the disproportionate effects of them that were for women or for Black people, for immigrants, refugees, or other caste systems in other places. That was the way they were designed. And in order to fix them, we need to do something different. because it restricts their ability to thrive, which restricts GDP growth, which restricts the ability for investors to earn the returns that they're looking for ultimately in the system. So, it starts with the moral reprehensibility. I want to just be clear about that. But it also means that investors will be harmed. People who are creating businesses will be harmed. In America, the cost of racism just over the last 30 years is $22+ trillion. If we were to have earned $22+ trillion, what more good could we have done for our infrastructure, for our education? That money could have been invested in other ways, in people, and in the ways that folks have more opportunity to thrive. More businesses could have been created, safer systems, what could you have done with $22 trillion? And that's just in America. The study I just posted in the chat from Brookings kind of talks that through, but what of other places in the world? What of other places that, then GDP is not even a great measure of economic performance, because the informal economy that largely is driven by women in global South, doesn't even so much count in those places. But what if we included them? What if we included them being women? What if we included them people at the margins and allowed those folks to thrive too? It's just food for thought, because part of it is that what do we want? What is the world we seek to have? And the opportunity cost has been hard for people. And so we take what is, and these systems that are set up with the gender disparities and the racist disparities that the structural barriers that were there. But what if we removed them? Imagine, we would all be better off. Not just the marginalized people who are harmed currently, but the whole system would be more resilient, fewer economic busts, people not harmed by the vagaries of climate change. We would all be better off. Why don't we want that world? I think we largely do, but what we haven't done is acknowledge the world that we are in. So, I'll pause there, and that's the answer to your question.
You've worked across a variety of streams, from the, financial markets to international development, and with all kinds of investors. And now you're also at the forefront of, engaging institutional investors and a broader set of investors and educating them on this. And you're also super tapped into the ecosystem, the broader impact investment ecosystem. So you can see all of the activity going around climate change and equity. From your view and from what you're seeing, which do you think is harder or easier? Getting capital owners to fight for climate or to fight for equity?
I think the proof is in the pudding. We have seen a more intensified fight for climate, and that wasn't always true. So 10 years ago, even climate wasn't on the radar like it is now. That's not to say the climate issue wasn't an issue in crisis even then. I just think back to my time coming out of business school in my earlier years in investment banking. Climate was not on the radar. It's on the front page of the FT now. And so that's a change. And so clearly, climate has made strides. Not to say that it's we've solved it, by no means, but we've made strides. But equity is still largely underappreciated, from gender, racial, geographic equity, all kinds of equity is generally underappreciated as a systemic risk, but also it, again, deals with messy humans and challenging our self-identities as people who've been complicit in the harm related to gender and racial bias is hard for people. And I think that's partly one of the reasons why we haven't seen as much progress there. We can be at arm's length around the environmental issues in some ways, but we cannot be at arm's length around what we believe about women, what we believe about people of a variety of different ethnicities. We have views. And if the in-group bias is what largely we see today, but that comes on the back of historical structural biases that were built into the system where women could not have a job, could not have a bank account. In some places in the world, that's still true. But there are places where, and times when you could openly discriminate for any number of reasons in my parents' lifetimes. So I think the fight for the equity and the justice aspects means that we have to challenge who we think we were, who we think we are. And that's hard for people. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't and that we don't have a moral obligation to do so, because the world needs to be a better place now. We see it, we can't unsee it. And that's just the challenge of today, is to do the work required to be on that journey to creating more equitable outcomes.
Speaking of the equity question, in your organization, and I know you have a few, how do you promote equity, diversity, or inclusion in your mission, business model, or operations?
So yeah, this is, I have like 3 jobs. And as you know, my family is Jamaican. And the joke is, of course, that Jamaicans have to have at least 3 jobs. I can say that because I'm Jamaican. But, truly, I have a day job at TIP, the Investment Integration Project. And really the idea of centering systems change in how we do tomorrow is the day job's work. The side jobs work of the podcast is, and then for those who are not familiar, I'll put the link to it in the chat, is moving capital towards justice. And that inherently is talking about how do we think differently about the way that we allocate, move capital, decide on what in the regulatory environment. It has many refractions, but it's ultimately about choice making. Because thinking and rethinking is choices that people or humans are making. Our decision whether we will redress or not harm that we have caused is a decision. That's people making choices. And whether or not we get to the point where we actually care to make more people on the planet thrive and get towards liberation, that's the will. Do we have that will to choose a different normal and choose to make and contribute to a different next normal? So the project that I've just launched about a month ago or so, hot off the press, is the Make Justice Normal project, because ultimately that is both a personal mission, it's a hashtag, but it's also a goal for our systems. Can we make justice normal? Because it isn't currently, and that's really the point. What is normal right now is injustice. Can we flip that? Is it possible? And that is the challenging question. And really the narrative change, we need to say, yes, it is. And then what do we have to do to make that come true? Because it will take work. And so, this is something that I think a lot about, both with my day job, my side jobs, my hobbies, because diversity, equity, and inclusion are one piece of doing the next normal better. But it's not limited to that. So because we just talked about earlier, it's all interlinked. We also have to layer on that climate. Everything needs to be done with a climate lens today. And everything needs to be done with equity, inclusion, justice lens today. We can't bifurcate these things because they are linked, because humans are affected, because we live in the planet. So here we are. So, these are the things I think often about. And really, I'm trying to also stand up this one idea, which I'll put the link to. Wasn't going to share this before because it's still in a bit of stealth mode, but we have enough few people on this call that we can talk about it a little bit. So this idea of the Restarter Fund is also something I'm working on. Again, in my other free time that I mentioned, I have a 2-year-old, is this idea that is who is going to be left out of the recovery of post-COVID? What is the solution we need that is basically built for this moment and the unique challenges that this moment has brought, particularly small business owners? In the United States, about 40% of all small businesses have already closed. And whose client is a failed business owner? Nobody's. And so this Restarter Fund concept is a concept to essentially stand up a fund to serve that failed business owner who's essentially a mispriced risk in this current economy. Many people, of course, have decades, generations potentially, if not just a handful of years of business experience, but they closed because COVID was the ultimate force majeure. What can we do to think about how to connect those people to the capillaries for recovery, because they are not right now. And what can we do to think about climate change as we bring them back, if we can indeed bring them back? And what are the adaptations needed in this current moment, either to digitize, to be part of the modern economy, if they weren't already, to think about adaptations related to disability and other kinds of ways that people were left out. And what of the places that didn't have like a opportunity next door because there was no next door in rural economies and in tribal lands, particularly in the US context. So those people and those places might be harmed for a generation if we don't figure out how to plug folks back in. And that leads to other kinds of problems, of course. Unemployment is a blight on certain kinds of neighborhoods more than other places. And what does that mean if we don't do something to fix them, when that slice of the economy is a system-wide risk that we are all facing because they face the system-wide problem that was called the pandemic? So that Restarter Fund concept is meant to hopefully do something about that if I can get it off the ground. So you heard it here first, folks. But watch this space. Hopefully we can will it into existence.
Confidential for now. There's a lot of talk about, both of these topics, and then you see that people aren't walking the walk. So, you could have a climate fund, but you go to their office and they don't even recycle. You can have organizations that call themselves intersectionally feminist, but you won't see any women of color on their leadership, etc. And sometimes there's a disconnect between the mission and how things actually operate inside of the organization. Now, as we're part of a shift within the private sector more broadly, but also within the impact investment ecosystem, we're part of this wave to address climate, to address equity. And we're definitely linked and on one accord about them both being intrinsic and kind of essential. Given these contradictions, though, and how organizations actually operate, what do you think leadership should look like in an equitable and inclusive organization? Any examples, any things to learn, any ways to actually get better at walking the walk, not just talking the talk?
Well, we know that the gap between talk and action is wide, and that's for a number of reasons. One of them is accountability. Who holds people accountable to this? Where is there not enough transparency and sunlight to even see where this is happening, except for in the places where the person experiencing it would then also be harmed by talking about it? And so when we think about what needs to be done, it's sort of clear, because you see, if the leadership doesn't reflect the population, something's happening. We can notice that. If there's an over and under index thing that's happening, that tells you something about either the rules or the decision makers. So we can observe and say, where's there the crisis of leadership, because it doesn't look equitable and inclusive, just by observation. We don't have to even get so under the hood, because it tells you that the practices are already something that doesn't make sense. And in-group bias is the most common form of bias. Explicit biases have been marched against for decades, and we have largely, in theory, changed the rules to not disallow for it, but we can just see what still is. Fewer than 2% of global financial assets are managed by women and people of color. That's what is. So that tells you something about how we got here. These rules don't work for, and the deciders didn't include. Why? I can't tell you what's in people's hearts and minds, but I can tell you what I see, and it's the output is clear. And so when we think about what does leadership look like in equitable, inclusive organizations, it looks like thinking about that. It looks like noticing that. There's a report from Darren Dodson at Illiman and Stanford Spark that talks about particularly the financial services industry and the fact that there are disparities in the way that we invest and who gets to do the investing. And what does that mean for what's invested in? That filters all the way down to social enterprises and ventures that get funded and don't. We can look at the venture funding models, but there's models outside of that would never even fit the venture model that also are harmed by the bias in the system, who gets funded even by loans from banks, not even necessarily equity funding from venture capital. But just look at people of color on boards or women in the C-suite. Right now, there are 3 Black women in the Fortune 500, 3 out of 500. That's 0.6%. What is the percentage of Black women in America? It's about 7%. Something's happening. Something's happening. So the point is we can notice that something is happening as leaders and say, is this what we want? Does it reflect our values? Does it affect the communities that we live in or around? Does it affect our population? Does it reflect our population where we happen to be geographically sat? And are we okay with that? Are we okay with that? Because you have to ask yourself. I mean, part of this, what we're getting to, is all about choice making. So leadership should look like the world they're in. And if it doesn't, notice that and fix the rules that exclude. It's that simple, but it's also that hard because it requires introspection and self-awareness at an individual level as well as an organizational level, and admitting the truths that are just observable.
Some organizations, when they look at this, they could say, oh, well, we will address, we'll improve our pipeline, but then they realize, oh, we don't have enough middle managers. Okay, so we'll improve the pipeline at the entry level, okay? But we don't find enough people with this expertise at entry level because of a disparity, let's say in college majors. Okay, so we'll work on that. The deeper you go, sometimes there's incremental costs to addressing the disparity, because as I believe you kind of alluded to, some of these things aren't priced in. So for organizations that want to become representative and are really thinking intentionally about it, there could sometimes be additional costs. Or actually, I'll pose the question, do you believe there would be additional costs? And for those that would maybe see that as a barrier, what would you say?
Well, there's costs now. They're just not necessarily borne by the organization. And so this is what we mean when we say externalities, and where does the costs fall? And partly why we need to think about systems and zoom out and to the idea of system level investing is that we need to see it all. And when you work in a system, there's multiple leverage points. So to your point, like if we fix the beginning of a linear system, we'll eventually over time fix it at the end. But these are systems. They're interlinked, they're complicated. There's gears shifting within gears, moving at different speeds. And because of this complexity, one simple silver bullet does not exist. And if we say I'm only responsible for the front end of the pipeline problem, and likely it's not actually a pipeline problem, because partly what this study that I shared, related to the last question is, it's not because that there are not enough managers out there who could do the job. It's because your rules exclude finding them. And so perhaps your pipeline problem is not actually the problem with the pipeline. The problem is the way that you're looking and where. And so maybe we need to reframe, we need to think differently, and we need to think about, well, the system change requires multiple leverage points being pushed at various times. There are some things that you might be responsible for and within your domain, and there's others that someone else might be responsible for, but a concerted effort is sometimes required. And this is partly one of the tools that we talk about when we talk about system level investing, is working in greater coalition might be required in order to fix the system. Alone, one single actor cannot fix a system. However, to your point, there are already costs. You might personally not be bearing them, but over time you will bear them if your leadership is not more diverse, if your board is not more diverse as an organization, because we know diversity is a strength, leads to better decisions and better outcomes. There's data related to that. And so over time, you will bear a cost, but the cost might be an opportunity cost, which is really difficult for people. And so could you have done better? Just like we talked about earlier, the cost of racism being $22 trillion. Because it wasn't a direct cost that somebody paid, we didn't all write checks, but the system itself bore the cost. There will be a cost, and your cost might be long-term. You could have grown better, faster, maybe made more returns. Maybe more people would have thrived and able to buy your goods and services. Maybe the costs are an opportunity cost, which is so much harder because it's happening in the future. And humans have a very difficult time, behavioral economics will tell you, of prioritizing the future self. And so when we think about the costs, maybe it's not writing a check today, but there's a cost to that over time to your business, of your ability to be resilient. Maybe there's reputational risk cost that might not be borne today, but in 10 years, when you look a certain way, monochromatic, I like to gently say, then are you going to be okay with that? Will consumers want to buy your goods and services? Will people want to work there? We're already seeing that more diverse employers are attracting better talent. So there might be a cost. It might be, though, not a check you have to write.
Do you have any advice for others? And this is split into two streams. Mm-hmm. Advice for others who are intrigued by what you've shared about systemic or systems level investing, 21st century investing, and advice for emerging leaders who may be on this call who are thinking about these issues as far as charting their strategies for contributing to a more inclusive world.
Yeah, I mean, from an investor perspective, 21st Century Investing, the book that the founders of TIP wrote earlier this year, is a roadmap for how to do it differently, how to think in systems and think about the ways, and you might need to do different things in your practice in order to deliver on those goals. They have a framework called the 10 Tools of Intentionality, which are some of the tools and the advanced techniques that investors particularly have to or could adopt in order to be able to move the needle on systems change as a financial services industry actor. The book Moving Beyond Modern Portfolio Theory can also complement understanding from an investor perspective. And this starts to get into how the modern portfolio theory just essentially is ill-equipped for pricing externalities and dealing with the problems of today. I'll post the link in the chat here. Those two co-authors are friends of the Investment Integration Project, John McComnick and Jim Hawley. And then really it gets to, what world do you want to have? We basically have a choose your own adventure books. I don't know if any of you read those when you were little or younger. You know, you have options. You can pick what's behind door number one or behind door number two. If door number one is a more just world that allows more people on the planet to thrive, and door number two is what we have now or worse, which do you pick? And if you then choose what's behind door number one, what do you need to rethink about what you want to do with your life? If you're already a business owner or an investor, what's your current practice? How did you arrive at that process or business model? Did you just take whatever existed and doing it without thinking about ways that it could cause harm? About who are all the stakeholders in your world? Are you intentional about employees, about others outside of your organization, and the ways that your supply chain indirectly or directly can be impacting or harming people? Are there oppressive labor practices in your own work or in the downstream to keep margins low? What of modern slavery, including the oppression of women, children, or other marginalized people? Have you thought about it? If you haven't, that's an opportunity to do better and to rethink. Are you contributing directly or indirectly to climate change? We often think about climate change as like, what did I produce potentially? But what about the waste part? What's the circular economy part of your thinking? If we haven't, then there's an opportunity to rethink. And so my advice is look at yourself and your organization. Think about your career if you're not yet in, you're still a student. And what's the world you want to live in? And then what, given your skills and talents, do you want to do about it? And so, I often think justice is fractal. It begins with the self and ends with the system. And there's many points in between. So, what do you want to embody? And ask yourself that. And then ultimately, I like to ask this question in my podcast. This is the final question to my podcast guests. What do I need to do to be a good ancestor? It gives you enough distance on today to zoom out. What about the long term? What about the systems needed for the long term? What would I do differently today if I was crafting tomorrow's system? And I am responsible for contributing to that and thinking about myself as an ancestor who's taking actions today that will affect people for generations to come, because they are. And that's often a way to get the distance needed to be able to rethink and think about, do you want to take door number 1 or do you want to take door number 2?
I wanted to open up to the students or any of the other attendees to see if there's any questions. I, of course, have my own questions, but I at least wanted to give others a chance to chime in with theirs. And I'm happy to ask mine. Just trying to give others a chance as well.
I actually have a question. Can I ask you one, Tara?
Sure.
Turn the table for a moment. When you were thinking about this series in general, what was the highest priority in terms of the kinds of things that you thought students and others in the Oxford ecosystem needed to understand why this was an important series to undertake?
Good point. So Oxford's been known for educating leaders forever and ever, and increasingly, you know, the leaders of the economy, of even popular culture and thought, are the entrepreneurs. So Oxford has also been emerging as a key node in the UK and potentially even global entrepreneurial ecosystem, especially when you look at things like commercialization. The school has some of the highest startup commercialization rates that lead to some really big startups and scale-ups. And yet there wasn't a full light shined on the role this ecosystem and the university within this ecosystem should be thinking about the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we know there's all these startups linked to Oxford. They're doing really well, they're growing, the school wants to do more, wants to educate more. But how do we link the work that's been going on for decades around the school's position as a node in the impact ecosystem that is supporting a lot of social entrepreneurs and the broader Oxford engagement and the startup ecosystem? How do we link all of this to a broader discussion of diversity, equity, inclusion, so that we have more emerging entrepreneurs coming out of this ecosystem, the Oxford ecosystem, and more emerging impact investors coming out of the Oxford ecosystem that are prepared to be good ancestors, that are prepared to build businesses that are not just solving, you know, market failures in terms of a product or service need, but that are considering it from this holistic lens, and are building businesses that also contribute to a more equitable economy. Wouldn't that be great? So that was the vision behind OXIFIED more broadly, and I wanted to have a series of speakers that could help students and the broader ecosystem think through some of these topics.
No, that's really powerful. And so it's interesting just to think about market failures, because market failures, the opposite side is the opportunity, yes? And so in America, in the US context, racism is probably one of the largest market inefficiencies. And so fixing it is one of those things that's essentially a significant market opportunity for inclusive and collective growth. And when we think about the way that, well, global demographics, who are the consumers of today and tomorrow? Well, they're increasingly non-white. They're increasingly not English speakers. And what do we do if we prioritize where the world is going and not where the world was? And what are the market failures that we are not prioritizing because they're not the needs of the global north, who has been sort of the archetypical privileged consumer. And if we were fixing things that were higher priorities in terms of climate change and allowing more people to thrive, including the way we distribute capital, we would actually get more bang for our buck. If we invested in the higher priority needs related to SDGs as a framework, we would get more bang for our development buck. We would get more bang for our impact buck if we did the things that were at the intersections of these things. Yes, because when we think about climate change, one of my past podcast guests described it as the opportunity of humanity financing the just transition. Just think about the trillions needed for clean infrastructure. Think about the clean trillions we need to finance the innovation part of climate, not just the mitigation part. We need new solutions for tomorrow that don't yet exist. And that's part of what, Glasgow and the net zero commitments are. We're going to invest in the thing that doesn't exist yet. Well, who's going to actually invest today in the innovations that will lead us to getting the things that don't exist yet? So the opportunity of humanity is actually at the intersection of these two thoughts. And so the ultimate market failures have been getting here. Climate change is actually, if we frame it as a market failure, we might be able to think about it as an opportunity. And if we thought about economic exclusion as a market failure, if we thought about the current gender injustice that exists as a market failure, because we know that putting more women in the workforce adds to GDP, period, it must. More numbers doing things is more. And why don't we think about that way? Well, I do. So when we say we, again, who is not thinking about that in this way? So I just want to offer that up to folks to think about what are the norms about these narratives that we already are assuming in, and how do we get away from that in order to build the better businesses of tomorrow?
Well, the School Center talks a lot about systems change, and yet our first conversation about systems change was one of the most poignant and provocative ones that I kept turning around in my head afterwards. So I knew that I had to have you come for a fireside chat. And I encourage all of the students and other ecosystem participants that are joining today or that are watching this on YouTube subsequently, if you're thinking about systems change, if you're thinking about social change, if you're thinking about what you want to create, definitely look at some of the research and publications that Monique has shared with us over the course of today's call, but also consider this holistic vision that she's pointed of some of the market failures, but also a different way that we can do investment and a different way that we can build financial markets and a different way that we could recreate the private sector.
And I'll just share one thing because I know we're at time. Someone asked in the question in the chat, what are some of the answers to being a good ancestor that we've talked about on the podcast? And I just want to offer kind of one that's an amalgamation of a couple of different responses. And one is we need to put love into this. And why love? Because it deals with how we feel and what we prioritize. Love is an action verb. And so if we actually were to love each other, our earth, our shared humanity, we would do things differently. And that is one of the answers that I thought was just transcendent in some ways. And the other one is, what's the opposite of love? It's not hate, it's apathy. We don't care about those things that we didn't design for, the externalities that we talked about before, or else we would have put them in already. So what does that mean about the things that we choose not to care about and are apathetic? And so what is, and what the current situation that we have is that we haven't cared about the environment. Its proof is in the pudding. We haven't cared about the fallout for certain people from the ways that we do business and the fact that it excluded. That's the apathy part. So if we love each other enough to care, we would do something about it. And so I thought that was a really powerful answer. And one of the things that is how I'm trying to be a good ancestor is put the sentence out there that we need to make justice normal. because that alone already starts to hopefully have people begin the rethinking. What do you mean? Doesn't mean that injustice is, because if that is true, the opposite must also be. Injustice is what's normal. And how are we complicit or contributing to it? And how might we not be if we don't want that reality? I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much, Monique. It's been a joy to be with you. And I'm sure that the attendees and listeners are going to get a lot out of this call. And I look forward to continuing to do all of our work, the many synergies, as we try to make justice normal, and as we try and do our bit to contribute to systems change and being good to ancestors.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.